just a quick note before we start today's episode. I want to let you know that Lindy Line, a story podcast, will be moving. We're not finishing, we're just moving. You will, moving forward, be able to find this podcast alongside my other podcast, Conversations with Storytellers, at smbrooks.podbean.com, and you will be able to find it with Conversations with Storytellers on all of your podcast providers. I hope this move works for all of us. Thanks. Hello, fellow story champions. My name is Simon Brooks. Welcome to Lindy Line, a story podcast. Here you will find old stories, some written by the likes of Kipling and Robert Louis Stevenson, E. Nesbit and Louise Saunders, as well as ancient folk tales and fairy tales, retold for a modern audience of families. There are also original short stories I've penned myself. I will be reading some of the classic folk and fairy tales, along with some other stories that you may not be so familiar with. I have a very special episode for you today. When I was growing up, one of my favourite books that my mum used to read to me was called Timothy Tabbycat. And it was about this cat and his friend called Willy Straw. It was written by Barbara Mary Campbell way back in 1947, and she wrote under the name of Cam. This book was my mum's, who grew up with it, and a few other Cam books, but this one was my favourite. It was the colours that Cam used and the details of the dragon that made it work for me. And so many details in the illustrations, little bits and pieces that were hidden away. You could look at them forever. Well, at least until my light was turned out. I found someone online who has scanned all of the images from the book, and I'll put the link to those in the show notes so that you can also see them. I truly hope you enjoy this story as much as I did as a kid. And I still do. Timothy Tabbycat by Cam. Timothy Tabbycat lived with his special friend Willy Straw in a cottage near the sea. They kept house together and cooked their own meals. One day, when they were collecting sticks for their fire, they found a queer, strange-looking, bright blue bottle, and they liked it so much that they took it home and put it on the windowsill. That night, when they were asleep, 2 bats called Flippy and Flappy came in through the window and flew around the bottle. They made such a noise that Timothy Tabbycat woke up and asked them politely what they wanted. They said they wanted to rescue their friend Phoebe the hare, who lived on the moon. She had been caught by 2 wicked old witches, and the moon was dreadfully upset. "You see," said Flippy and Flappy, who always talked together, "if we don't rescue Phoebe, they'll cook and eat her because jugged hare is their favourite supper, and just look how unhappy and blue the poor moon is. We must have the bottle because the water inside it is magic, and we're afraid it's an awful dangerous adventure, and—" By this time, Willy Straw was dressing, and Timothy Tabbycat said, "We better come with you because we're very good at dangerous adventures." And so off they went, flying. They came to a snowy and windy place in a forest where icicles hung from the trees. Willy Straw put the bats in his pocket to keep them warm, and they searched for shelter for the night. Suddenly they saw the light of a cottage, and as they drew near, an old woman with a red shawl and a pointed hat came out to meet them. She didn't seem a bit surprised. "So here you are, my dearies," she said in a cracked voice. "Come in, come in." It was so warm and cosy by the fire that Willy Straw went fast asleep, but not Timothy. He was exploring. He crept round corners and he frightened the mice until he saw the old woman creep up to Willy Straw and steal the blue bottle. The truth is, the old woman was one of the 2 wicked witches who had stolen Phoebe the hare, and her name was Mrs. Longtooth. When Timothy saw her take the blue bottle, he shouted, "Hoy!" in his very loudest voice. This so startled Mrs. Longtooth that she spilt some of the magic water on herself, and sizzle, fizz, Timothy caught the bottle. Mrs. Longtooth vanished in a cloud of smoke, and so did her cottage and the snow and the ice. They found themselves out in the green forest again. Setting off, they came to a great lake, with a high, dark castle in the middle, and at the foot of the castle steps lay an enormous dragon. And in this castle, is where Phoebe the hare was hidden. They stood and stared at it, wondering how they were ever to get inside. Then they saw the little yellow duck. They didn't take much notice of her until she dived into the water and made curious bubbling noises. Then they saw that she had got caught in some weeds. If Timothy hadn't pulled her out, she would have drowned. Naturally, she was very grateful, and when Timothy said that they wanted to get to the castle, she pulled a feather out of her tail and said, "There you go, dear. It's a magical feather that my fairy godmother gave to me. Put it in the water and see what happens." Well, what happened was that the feather turned into a boat. They all got in, and so did Deborah the duck, and 2 rabbits and the squirrel, who said they would like to help. Willy Straw sculled, and Flippy and Flappy pointed the way. There was the awful dragon, lying right around the castle. The thing to do about the dragon, so Flippy and Flappy said, was to pour some of the magic water on the very tip of its tail, and then he would vanish in a cloud of smoke, just like Mrs. Longtooth. But when they landed and crept on the castle steps, they found that the dragon was asleep, and that the tip of his tail was hidden under his enormous chin. What should they do? They thought, and they thought. Then Timothy Tabbycat had an idea. Ever since he had frightened Mrs. Longtooth and made her vanish, he had been thinking what a loud and terrifying voice he must have. So now he thought that if he were to creep up to the dragon and shout his loudest into his ear, the dragon would sit up in fright, and then they would pour the magic water on the tip of his tail. So up crept Timothy, and he shouted his very hardest, which frightened the dragon out of his wits, and Willy Straw was able to pour the magic water on the tail. There was a pop and a cloud of smoke, and in the dragon's place was an ordinary little lizard, looking rather surprised. And then another little lizard ran up to the other to see his little brother, who had been Mrs. Longtooth's dragon. Meanwhile, Timothy and Willy Straw and the others ran up and up the castle steps and got quite out of breath. At the very top they came to a kitchen, and here they found poor little Phoebe the hare shut in under a meat safe with a rope tied round her middle, looking the picture of misery. The vegetables were all ready for cooking with her, and there were little gnomes peering around the door, glad that Phoebe will be rescued. They freed Phoebe in no time, but suddenly Flippy and Flappy, who were keeping watch, cried out that the witch was coming. This was the second witch, and her name was Mrs. Snatch-and-Grab, and she was even worse than Mrs. Longtooth. She came flying in on her broomstick, but Phoebe was free, and in a flash Timothy had leapt on top of the door with the blue bottle. He poured out all that was left of the magic water. There was the biggest sizzle and fizz you ever heard, and absolutely everything vanished. Phoebe the hare went soaring like a rocket to her home in the moon, and Timothy and Willy Straw went tumbling down through the clouds. As for Flippy and Flappy and the others, well, I don't know exactly what happened to them, but I do know that they all got home safely in the end. So did Timothy Tabbycat and Willy Straw. Down and down and down they fell until bump! There they were on the floor of their bedroom, all mixed up with the bedclothes. As soon as they got over their surprise, they ran to the window to see if Phoebe had got back safely and if the moon was looking happy again. And he was. So they were all happy, and they hope you are too. Good night. I hope you love the story as much as I do, as well as the pictures. Go and have a look at them. And as Cam said, good night. Thanks for listening to Lindy Line. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I will be back soon with some more stories and maybe a few poems. By simply subscribing, giving stars and telling your friends about this podcast helps. What helps more is leaving a review or starring on Podbean and Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to this, as it helps others find these stories, and it also helps me. Most podcasters have advertisers, and we don't. If you want to drop the price of a dog biscuit for Mo and the cost of a cup of tea for me, that would be lovely. It's hungry work out in the woods. You can also become a Patreon and pay as little as $1 to as much as you think it was worth. If you become a Patreon patron at www.patreon.com/Simon Brooks, you will get extra resources and other goodies too, including the occasional photograph or two of Mo, my wonderful rescue dog, and photographs of our adventures together. #InTheWoodsWithMo. You can find me on Instagram at Simon M. Brooks, which is also my Substack handle. Be well, be happy, and be you.